Thank you, Ceann Comhairle. Taoiseach, since the refusal of Ministers Taoiseach Simon Coveney, Minister Richard Bruton last week to divulge crucial information, particularly in relation to the amount of money being put up front by Granahan McCourt against the taxpayers' contribution of $3 billion in terms of the National Broadband Plan, a lot of information has emerged, and I think the Sunday Times article by Justine McCarthy was particularly revealing at the weekend in relation to many matters. But we now know that Minister Creed on Clare FM, unaware of any constraints that beset the other ministers, said the company was putting, I think, in the region of something shy of 200 million. Still somewhat, a lot of breath there. And this was the day after the Cabinet had decided to award preferred bidder status. So Minister Creed didn't pluck that from the air. He knew what he was talking about, obviously. And now we learn today Minister Bruton will tell the committee that the figure is 220 million between equity and working capital. So I want to ask you, Taoiseach, will you break that down for us today and give us what is the equity and the working capital? Furthermore, Taoiseach, because the context of this is very clear, and why were we looking for the figure? And why was the government refusing to give the figure? Because the Secretary-General of the Department of Public Expenditure said that there were unprecedented risks to the exchequer posed by this particular project, and he referenced in the memo to government that the private sector is only risking so much, redacted figure at the time, of their own funds. And the general public and the taxpayer were entitled to know, given the unprecedented risk to them about everything to do with this project. Now, the Sunday Times article also reveals an important matter in terms of the fact that the Department of Communications have confirmed that Granahan McCourt relied on the financial performance of a US company owned by David McCourt's brother, Frank McCourt, to meet the qualifying criteria on the procurement process. In other words, it didn't have enough itself, and it relied entirely on a separate entity to underpin its financial security. Were you aware of that, Taoiseach? Was the government aware of that? And it's significant in the context of this meeting in July last July between former Minister Naughton and David McCourt, and Frank McCourt was at that meeting, where 4 items were discussed in relation to this project. I always felt those meetings were wrong and inappropriate in the middle of a tendering process, and they cast a stain over the entire process. I don't know whether Peter Smith interviewed Frank McCourt or not in context of his review, but we need clarification in relation to that. And also the role of KPMG, which advised the Department on the gap funding contract. They advised the Department that Granahan McCourt had the capability to undertake the project. Yet we learn also that the Department has paid KPMG 11.6 million for its advisory services since 2015. Is it appropriate, Taoiseach, that KPMG would be both the auditors for Granahan McCourt and also used by the Department to give them reassurance on their financial capabilities? So to sum up, Taoiseach, will you give a breakdown of the 220 million figure? Do you agree with the Secretary-General of the Department of Public Expenditure that this is an unprecedented risk to the taxpayer and that the value for money assessment is simply not credible? And can you explain the role of Frank McCourt and the global company that's underpinning the entire project?
Taoiseach.
Thanks. Thanks very much, Deputy, and I'll be happy to answer those questions. But I think before we do that, we shouldn't lose sight of what the objective is here. This plan, the National Broadband Plan, is the biggest investment in rural Ireland ever, probably the most significant to take place since rural electrification. It's about connecting 1.1 million people, 450,000 homes, 50,000 farms, 50,000 businesses to high-speed broadband. It's ambitious. We'll be one of the first countries in the world to do this, if not the first. And we've chosen fibre as the technology because nothing is faster than the speed of light, nor will anything ever be faster than the speed of light. It's good for the economy in terms of encouraging home working, will be good for the environment in terms of reducing commuting and emissions, will help us to enable modern educational techniques and e-health in particular. The contract isn't signed yet. It'll be September or October before we're in a position to sign it. There will be hearings. Minister Bruton is at one today in the Joint Oireachtas Committee. There will, I'm sure, be debates about it. And the one thing I would just ask of the opposition parties here, and I ask this sincerely, of the main opposition party, but of the others too, is I would appeal to you to not rule out supporting the National Broadband Plan just yet. Spend some time to hear the arguments, spend some time to consider it. Because if we do not sign this contract in a few months' time, it is back to square one. and the digital divide between urban and rural Ireland will remain and deepen, and it will take many years before we can put together another plan again. So I'd appeal to you not to rule out supporting this until you've had a chance to consider all the facts and scrutinise the alternatives. And in relation to how I came to supporting this decision, it was back in October after Minister Naughton resigned, and I asked Richard Bruton to take on this job. And I asked him to look at the whole thing afresh, see if this was the right thing to do, look at the alternatives, see if there was an easier, cheaper, better or quicker way to do this. And he considered all the options and came to the same conclusion that government came to last week, that there isn't a better option. Any alternative option will involve delays, will be slower, will cost as much, if not more, and mightn't even meet that objective of connecting all homes, farms and businesses in the country. In terms of financial model, this is a €5 billion project. It's important to bear that in mind. 6 billion if you include VAT and contingencies, over 25 years. Of that 5 billion, the company has to come up with 2.4 billion. That's equity, that's working capital, that's borrowing and user charges. And the state only pays its subsidy after the work is done. So they have to roll out the fibre. It's only after they've passed the home, farm and business that they get paid, and they get paid more when they're connected. And the company has to come up with the full 2.4 billion. What you're zeroing in on here is one aspect of the funding, and that is the initial equity and working capital. And that is 220 million, about 175 working capital and 175 equity and 45 working capital. But that's only the initial upfront investment by the company. The total amount they have to find is 2.4 billion in what is a €5 billion project. And if this project is successful, yes, the company will get its equity back and a return on that. But if rollout is delayed, as some people predict it will, if take-up is not as fast as we project, well then the company will have to put in more equity. And that's the crux of this.
Time is up.
The private company, NBI, is taking the risk here. Their risk is not capped. The risk to the state is.
Deputy Martin.
I asked you 4 questions. I have no intention of going into electioneering because everybody is committed to broadband. I asked you to give the breakdown, which you just did at the end, but I also asked you, do you agree with the Secretary-General of the Department of Public Expenditure that this is an unprecedented risk to the taxpayer and that the value for money assessment is simply not credible? Now, I asked you a simple, straight question. Did you agree with the entirety of what the Department of Public Expenditure have put on the record in relation to this, and who were very, very clear that the risk is to the state to a far, far greater degree than to the private sector itself. And it makes the point that I believe that there are unprecedented risks to the Exchequer posed by this proposed project. Those are not my words. Those are the words of the Secretary-General of the Department of Public Expenditure. I asked you to explain the role of Frank McCourt and the company that's underpinning the entire bid. And for some reason you choose to ignore that question in its entirety. And I would ask you again, were you aware that it was another company that was underpinning the financial criteria, if you like, governing Granahan and McCourt, and not actually Granahan and McCourt itself? And I also asked you then, in terms of the KPMG, the auditors to Granahan and McCourt, is it appropriate that they should also be the advisors to the department, and that the department ask the company's auditors what else they're going to tell them as to the capacity of Granahan and McCourt to proceed, and whether you can confirm that Peter Smith actually spoke to Frank McCourt in relation to that meeting in July, where the financials of this project were discussed in New York in the presence of former Minister Naughton.
Taoiseach.
I don't know the answer to your question in relation to Peter Smith, but I will inquire and let you know as soon as I can find out. That was an independent process audit, as you know, so I didn't have any involvement in it. I don't agree that this is unprecedented. I consider, for example, the fact that we as a state over 10 or 20 years found €8 billion to connect our cities by motorway. We connected Dublin, Limerick, Cork, Waterford and Galway by motorway. We spent €8 billion to do that. This is €3 billion to connect 1.1 million homes across the country, all 26 counties. So no, I do not agree that this is an unprecedented investment, nor do I think it is an unprecedented risk. In terms of the cost-benefit analysis, it was done independently. I believe it stacks up. It shows that the benefits outweigh the costs. In the optimistic scenario, in the pessimistic scenario and in the central case scenario. And I think that cost-benefit analysis is actually conservative, because it doesn't take into account the wider societal benefits from connecting 1.1 million people across rural Ireland to high-speed broadband. What are those wider societal benefits? Things like access to e-health, for example. Things like access to education online, which is now becoming an increasingly important aspect of education. Kids being able to download things from Google, being able to access apps online. Doesn't take into account the climate action benefits that arise from this. More people being able to work at home, fewer people commuting. Doesn't take into account the positive impact that it could have on things like rural isolation. So I think the cost-benefit analysis is actually conservative in that regard. In relation to the financial and other capacities of the bidder, I am aware that the bidder passed all of the tests for capacity, and that was assessed in terms of their capacity and capability. They had to before they pre-qualified for this. And in terms of KPMG, I think KPMG is a respected company and a respected accounting house, and they are respected auditors. And I think it would be wrong to cast aspersions on that company in this House and somehow to suggest that they're conflicted. I think that's unfair.